Hello, it's me again. I want to talk about this thing called abiotic oil, and basically, it's a theory that oil is formed by other ways other than the decomposition of organic material, and the idea that oil comes from decomposed organic material. I've been taught that since grade school, and it has it has been challenged from time to time. And in our world, there is such a theory that oil is abiotic. It does not come from decayed organic material, and believe it or not, the first abiogenic hypothesis was given to the world, to the scientific community, in the 16th century by a guy named Georgius Agricola. And the Russians have done extensive research on this topic and have contributed much to the hypothesis. And as recently as 2009, scientists in Stockholm have recently presented their findings and added to the abiotic oil theory. Now, I'd like to read what science says about it, because I guess the prevailing explanation, the official explanation, it goes like this. Petroleum is formed when large quantities of dead organisms, mostly plankton and algae, are buried beneath the sedimentary rock and subjected to intense heat and pressure. And this would all be over millions of years. And that is how oil is formed. That's what I was always taught in school, etc., etc. And I guess, I've thought this over quite a bit, and there's a couple of things that I wonder about with this explanation. The first thing, to give you an idea of how much oil we're talking about, they estimate that since we started using oil, the world has used almost 1.5 trillion barrels of oil. And that 1.5 trillion barrels, that's I can't begin to imagine what that would look like if it was poured into a crater or something like that. But I'm pretty sure you're talking about a small sea of oil. It's a vast amount of oil that we've used to this date. And when I think of that in my mind, a small sea of oil, and I wonder how much algae would it take? I mean, we're talking a lot of algae. And if, I know we've all seen algae. It's not like it's a big head of cabbage or something. It's almost like green dust. And I know we all can agree that when anything decomposes, it loses a lot of mass. So I'm wondering how much decomposed algae would it take to form 1.5 trillion barrels of oil? I can't even begin to imagine. And it doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't. The second thing is oil is normally found beneath the surface of the earth. And I guess the shallowest well we know of, well, some of it comes actually, in the old days, I guess it would come up on the ground. But, 200 feet deep was, it's on record, and I guess when they first started drilling. And nowadays, the average depth of an oil well is, 1 second here, is about 2,500 feet down, and sometimes 6,000 feet below the surface of the earth. And we have wells on record that have gone 40,000 feet below the surface of the earth, and a well that deep hits oil. And of course, there's wells on the ocean floor, and they go almost a mile below the floor of the ocean and hit oil. And I'm not sure that there's a limit as to how deep you can drill and still hit oil. I think it's limited by the technology, but as of yet, I know of no depth that there's no sense in going any further. So my question is obvious. How did all that decomposed algae get all the way down there and turn into oil? And I know it millions of years, and I know all this other stuff, but it's very difficult for me to understand these two things. The incomprehensible amount of decomposed algae, and then the idea that this algae, this decomposed algae, can somehow find its way down beneath the surface of the earth to the tune of, well, as of today, to the tune of 40,000 feet below the surface of the earth. This makes no sense to me. And one thing that I was always raised to believe, and I remember this really well, was that the oil was finite. We had a limited amount of oil. It was made from decomposed matter and and there's some reserves and all this kind of stuff, but it was a very limited amount of oil. And to give you an example of that, and I remember this really well, during the Nixon administration, the world suffered an oil shortage. And hard to believe, but Richard Nixon passed emergency legislation. He limited the speed limit to 55 miles an hour. And I know you're not going to believe this, but gasoline was rationed in like this. People with a license plate that ended in an even number could buy gasoline on a certain day, and people who had license plate ended in an odd number, they got the other days, and they alternated. But you couldn't just buy gasoline anytime you wanted, And that rocked on. And Nixon he resigned, and his successor, Gerald Ford, took over. And Gerald Ford, he believed in it, so he had this program called WIN. It was called Whip Inflation Now. And it was something of an austerity program. And he was a very lovable guy, very likable, very cool guy. He rallied the nation behind this concept that we all have to rein it in and keep our driving habits under control, stop the Sunday driving and the joyriding and try to watch your mileage, tune up your engine, and then stop it with your frivolous spending, unnecessary purchases. Get frugal, get a bit austere, because it was to control inflation. And it was a success. Americans rallied behind this president, and we were doing it. And there was a day when the big boys, the executives, the oil people, came in to talk to Ford. And basically, now this is my imagination, this is how I imagine it, but they basically convinced him, they told him, you've got to cut this out. You know, congratulations on your whip inflation now thing, but you've got to stop this. You know, we're dying over here, and I'm sure they had to tell him with, when the mics are off and everything, Jerry, the oil shortage is fake. We lied, okay? We just wanted to drive the price up. Now stop it with your austerity program. You know, you got guys in Montana driving 55 miles an hour. They'll never get out of that state. So back off. And it did fade. He faded it all out, and then the successive presidencies, phased it out further and all that. And decades would go by, and we scarcely can remember that time when oil was in a shortage. We were running out. And I think that the hypothesis that oil comes from dead algae, it puts it in our mind that it's limited. There's a finite amount. And it may be finite, but we have used 1.5 trillion barrels to date. And in the shale deposits, just in America, there are 3 trillion barrels of oil. And then we all know what the Middle East is like in terms of oil. We're all familiar with Russia in terms of oil, Venezuela, the list goes on and on. So unbelievable to me that this stuff comes from algae that somehow leaks down up to 40,000 feet below the surface of the earth. It makes no sense to me. I wonder if oil is made by the earth. It's formed by the earth at the core or near the core, and it's like a mineral. It's part of the earth, and the oil from the heat and pressure is formed way down low, and the heat and pressure gradually gets the oil up toward the surface. And if it's left alone in certain areas of the world, it actually gets to the ground. It gets on the ground. But I would rather think that, if you can find it 40,000 feet below the surface of the earth, I think that points in the direction I'm going in. It's hard to believe algae could trickle down that far, especially an ocean of algae, to make a gigantic deposit. It makes no sense. But in my little world, that's how I imagine oil is produced. It's made by the earth and goes from deep inside the earth up, not the other way around. And in so many ways, I wonder if it does not take millions and millions and millions of years to make oil. I wonder. In my mind, it occurred to me maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years. I don't know. But I do know, and I've heard this from many oil workers, that it is very common to cap a well. But I've never heard of them just plowing it under, so to speak. Just forget it. Put the dirt on there, build a city, forget about it. It's not quite dry. But oil wells are always capped. I've never heard of them just deleted. And I've been told that, 30, 40 years later, they take the cap off, and guess what? They've got oil. Just recently, a gigantic oil discovery was reported in America. And guess where they found oil? Now, this is mind-boggling. They found oil in Texas. Go figure. Who would have thought Texas would have oil, And in my mind, I just imagined them driving out somewhere outside of Odessa, pry the cap off of one of their wells, and, oh, man, woo, we found oil. We discovered oil, So, yeah, these thoughts occur to me. Now, there's one other thing, as the idea that oil is finite, that it comes from algae, and there's not a lot of it left, and all that kind of thing. Let's just say a Frenchman had a great big piece of land in France, and on that land was a lake the size of Lake Erie, and that lake was filled with it was perfume. It comes out, some magical way it comes out of the earth, whatever. But it's a lake of perfume the size of Lake Erie. Well, the Frenchman takes a little bottle of it and brings it into the village. What he probably would tell him is, "Oh man, the ingredients are so rare, and there's so much labor involved in making this bottle, but I could sell it to you, for $1,000, but that's it. I can't. That's rock bottom price because it's just so hard to find the materials, and it's so difficult to make this stuff. Boom, boy, it sells for $1,000. And then, of course, when he comes back a week later or a month later with another little bottle, well, we're gonna have to go up to about $1,500 on this because we're running out. It's a rare thing that I've got here. It's like that. He's not going to go into the village and say, "Man, you want, bring we can fill up a 6-pack. Bring a barrel, man. There's plenty. It's because the price goes down and the demand goes down and everything. So I do believe that the oil companies have enjoyed that kind of mythology around oil that it's somehow we're going to run out. And you see them out in the ocean drilling, and we attack countries and destroy them and all that kind of thing. But it hit me during the Iraq War. Did we need their oil? No. We just didn't want them to have it. I mean, when you think about it, in the 100 years that we've been burning oil, we have seen nations like Iraq be removed from the world stage for a period of time. And we've seen nations the size of China enter the world stage, and China has no oil reserves of its own. It's an oil consumer. We've seen nations the size of India enter the world stage, oil consumer. All of the European Union. It goes on, to the tune of 1 trillion barrels. It does not affect the supply of oil, except what the time period I told you about where we had that shortage. But it's amazing to me. It's amazing to me. The oil supply on this day and at this hour is what they call a glut. I mean, we have too much oil. We actually have too much. And this is after using oil at 100 million barrels a day. So it is difficult for me to believe that it is as finite as I was raised to believe. And I have a real problem with the algae thing. And you're talking about a lot of algae. So anyway, those are my thoughts on oil and where it comes from. Later.